Our list of program speakers is pretty well filled out for the remainder of the year. But before I introduce our speaker for tonight, a quick word about who will be joining us next month. Many of you, most of you, maybe all of you know who Pat Hillman is. Perhaps you know her genealogical backstory. I'm of course referring to the Donner Party wagon train, the crossing of the Sierra in the winter of 1846, 1847. Well, Pat will join us in March. A DVD of that tragic journey has been produced, which we will be showing you. And then Pat will be here to answer any of your questions. And that program will be on March the 2nd. All of that said, I'd like to introduce our program and speaker for tonight. Even though genealogy may not be her profession, she certainly has taken her research to the next level. She's presented programs like tonight's to many groups. Back in September of 22, Pamela Dallas presented a 4-part program before the Fresno County Genealogical Society, for which our president, Lorraine Clark, was present. And Lorraine said this was a particularly good program. So see if you can find out who our speaker was that day and see if she can be our speaker in 23. Well, lo and behold, Pamela joins us tonight via Zoom with one of the parts of the program that she presented in Fresno. The program is entitled Siblings, Friends, and Enemies, Collateral Research. So now from her home in Granite Bay, California, which is just north of Sacramento, please join me in welcoming Pamela Bell Dallas.
Thank you, Dan. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
That's good. Okay. And I cannot see you. All I can see is my slide. So if there are questions, speak out. I would say jump up and down, but I won't be able to see that. So holler. And I like to address questions as we go along. And then certainly we will have a question and answer session at the end. And it's a little different and a little more difficult via Zoom since we can't really see each other in person. But I like to start out by asking how many people do their collateral research right from the beginning, as opposed to waiting until they hit the brick wall. I think a lot of us started out and we didn't really do a lot of collateral research. We waited until we hit the brick wall. And so hopefully that is not the case. Hopefully you're already doing your collateral research and you already know how important it is to your research and how much fun it is. The dictionary says that collateral, one of the definitions is having ancestors in common, but descended from a different line. And I say that collateral people are those individuals related to your direct ancestors by blood or marriage, business relationship or social relationship or geographic circumstances that probably hold the key to the answer of the genealogical question that has eluded you for 20 years or longer. I think when we stretch out laterally and search into the people that our ancestors interacted with, whether it was a business relationship, people of the same neighborhood, certainly family, even the enemies. Who did they sue? Who sued them? Who did they have little fights with that you might read about in the newspaper? All of this information put together can answer a lot of our questions. And hopefully some of the examples this evening will show how we can make that work for us. You will hear the term cluster research. I think of cluster research as more of researching the neighborhood, the township, If it's a small rural county, maybe even the whole county. A lot of times people traveled in groups, a religious group, maybe people who were pursuing a similar career to work or different things, moved as a group. So that can help you find the people that they moved with, migrated with, and then of course those people married each other's, those children, that's who they knew, so that's who they married. Collateral typically is more of families, business relationships, and other individuals. I'm sure you all know Elizabeth Shown Mills, and she has put the name, the fan club or the fan principle. She came up with that, which she calls friends, associates, and neighbors. And if you've read any of her articles on collateral research, everything she does is phenomenal. And those articles are really quite good. So those are available on her website, the NGS Quarterly, and a lot of other areas as well. So as I started out saying, we don't want to wait until we hit the brick wall to do our collateral research. If we're not doing it already, we should start tomorrow. And we're going to talk about some ways to start that. I look at it as a bullseye, that the person we're seeking is the bullseye. The person we're seeking is right in the middle of our target. And as we stretch out, we look at siblings, parents, grandparents, first cousins, aunts and uncles, distant cousins, in-laws, neighbors, church groups, organizations, friends, business circles, and then the enemies, because they can tell you an awful lot. So on this, I was just saying, so your bullseye, the center of your target is the target of your research, the individual that you are searching. And as you spread out over the target, it goes out in layers. And so you'll start looking for the siblings, then the cousins, the parents, the grandparents, the children. And then as you go further out, you go into the cousins, aunts and uncles, distant cousins, in-laws, and then keep going into neighbors, social circles, their churches, organizations, fraternal organizations, friends, business circle. And then we talked about the enemies, which you will find in the court records, the newspapers. And so you don't want to forget the enemies that maybe you can find information on, what's happening in their personal life and daily life. So if you're not already doing your collateral research, I would start with interviewing every family member that you can find and start gathering the information that they have. So next. And so people are tied together by a lot of different things, by blood, circumstances, the law, emotions, and all of these people can tell us about our family. And so we want to look at who purchased land at the same time. When we're looking up our land records, who witnessed their will, who were the administrators, who lived next door to them, who joined the church at the same time, who left that congregation at the same time. And so these are all clues to people that they were tied to that can give you answers to the questions that you're looking for. Next. And so when we're doing our collateral research, we want to look for people also with similar patterns. And that could be names, that could be occupations, that could be any pattern. That could be people who are migrating together, people of the same religion, any pattern that you can find. And then certainly we want to follow the neighbors, and the farther back in time we go, the more important those neighbors are to us. When we're looking at the census, we want to make sure that we're looking at the pages prior to and after the page that our ancestors are on. And it's a little difficult now. We do our census research online. And so sometimes we just get that line or that family. Whereas if you can get the whole census page in front of you and scroll forward and backwards, you want to make sure that you're spreading out and looking at as many entries as you can that surround that family, and understand that sometimes their neighbors are in a different jurisdiction, so they're not even on that census page or roll, if you will. Same thing with tax records. You want to study the tax records for several years, and we're going to look at an example of tax records in just a little bit. And then land records, a lot of people say, well, land records don't tell you much. Sometimes they tell you a lot, and they do show relationships. So we want to study those in depth as well. Next. And this is an Easter card that my brother sent me years ago. Everything to me has a relationship to genealogy. And I just love, you know, the older brothers, you know, if anybody went by on this vast desert, he would give his younger brother away. And even the mom is like, oh my gosh. And, you know, the kid is, yes, I've looked everywhere. And his Easter basket is behind the cactus, which is the only thing in sight. And I think sometimes, you know, in genealogy, we say, yes, I've looked everywhere. I can't find them. And we just need to spread out a little more. And a great example of this is people who marry in a Gretna Green area. And of course, as you know, a Gretna Green area is an area where you don't need a waiting period. You don't need, you know, all you do is show up with your money and you're married. And so people who say, well, my gosh, they spent their whole life in this area. Their kids were born here. They were born here. Their careers were here. They died here. They were buried here. Why is there no marriage record? Well, sometimes it's because they went to the Gretna Green area that, you know, and I do a lot of research in Indiana. A lot of people in Chicago were married in northern Indiana because that was a close by Gretna Green area. So if you look in Cook County, you won't find that marriage record. It's in another state. So just as an example, when we're looking for our collateral people and our main people, we want to keep that in mind, that the record could be there, we just haven't looked. And so it's similar with the census records. Sometimes their neighbors are in a different township, a different county, or maybe even a different state. So next. And just as an example, when you're doing your city directory research, we don't want to just look for their name and address. We want to take the collateral people and look in all of these areas as well, because city directories can tell us so much more than just their name and their address. We can know the cemeteries that were in that area at the time. We will know the newspapers that were being published at the time and the different organizations. And a lot of directories give us the list of the individuals who were born the year before it was published or that passed away the year before. And a good thing to keep in mind in the city directory, just because a woman is listed as a widow doesn't mean that she's a widow. She could be divorced and just doesn't want to tell the stranger standing on the doorstep that she's divorced, and knowing that that's going to be published in a publication that all of her friends and all, of course, they're going to figure it out anyway, but she's not necessarily going to want that published. So when we see widow on the census and in city directories, that isn't always the case. If we've lost somebody and we think, yep, he died, well, not necessarily. So next. So we're going to look at an example of a couple of census records here. We're not looking at the actual census, but information extracted from. So I was helping somebody look for this individual, Carrie Benson, and we were trying to find his place of birth because, as you know, we need to know, you can't just look in Ireland, we need to know the county. And so we had looked at a lot of different records, and she had not looked at all of the census records. And so we were going through looking at the census records. And so for 1870 and 1860, the place of birth for Carrie was given as Ireland. Next. So we decided that we would branch out and look at the whole family. So in 1850, all the siblings were living at home, and they all were indicated as having been born in Ireland. Next. So then we started looking at each one of them individually. So we found Carrie, who was our target person in 1860 and 1870, but it just said Ireland. So we're going to look at every single sibling, even though it's time consuming. We have to track them down. They may not be in the same jurisdiction, but we're going to track them down and see if we can get additional information. So Robert says Ireland. Next. Charles says Ireland. Next. Fanny says Ireland. And for Fanny, we had to find a married name. So, you know, this becomes a little bit time consuming. Next. Carrie, we already had. We already know that for Carrie, it said Ireland. James said Ireland. So it's starting to get a little, you know, you're tracking down all these people and not finding any new information. It's easy just to give up, but we're going to keep going. Next. Rose, again, we had to find a married name on her that said Ireland. Next. Finally, we get to the youngest, and Edward has Galway as his place of birth on the census. So it's worth branching out and tracking down all the siblings. So our target person, Carrie, never told us the county. And that doesn't mean that just because Edward was born in Galway, that Carrie was born in Galway, but we know the family was there, or at least Edward's mother, who we are assuming is also Carrie's mother, was in Galway at that time. So it gives us a starting point. Does that make sense? Next. So this is a plot of land that one of my ancestors owned on Ruff's Creek in southwestern Pennsylvania, very, very rural area. And my ancestor, Nathaniel Brown, owns the land right in the center. And all of the people surrounding are somehow tied to him. Thomas Wolverton, which is up on the left, upper left, is an individual that one of Nathaniel's daughters married into that family. Abel Bell is a son. Down on the lower right, George Hogue also ends up being related. Benjamin Bell on the very bottom, it says that's his claim of land at the time, and he ended up purchasing that. He is another son. And over on the lower right, Nathaniel Bell Jr. has that claim. That's another son. Next. As we research the records further and look into the wills, the tax records, and other records in the area, we find that everybody there is related. They all are related in some way. So surrounding Nathaniel Bell's land, which is on Ruff Creek, and this is in Greene County, Pennsylvania, and this is late 1700s. Nathaniel Bell Jr., as we just said, is a son. Abel is a son. Benjamin is a son. Thomas Wolverton is a son-in-law of Nathaniel. George Hogue married Nathaniel Sr.'s niece, and Philip Breston, his daughter, married another son. And so, you know, it's in the late, you know, in 1785, how far are you going to go to find a spouse? You know, and so unless somebody new comes in, or, you know, a brother brings, you know, somebody home that he served with in the military, or, you know, they just aren't going to go that far. And so as we spread out and look at the neighbors and the people that they came in contact with, you know, who did the fathers serve together in a organization? Did they have jury duty together? You know, they selected juries, and those juries served for a period of time. They might serve for a 6-month stint or a year or whatever. Those are the individuals that we need to be looking at. Next. And so here are some other names that are in that area. There's the map of Morgan Township. And so as we spread out and look at other neighbors, we find the surnames of Rush, Heaton, Enoch, Fraser, Buckingham, along with Wolverton, who we've already seen. Next. And in Nathaniel's will, you can kind of follow the arrow, and he's listing his children and who they married. And we see those surnames, Rush, Fraser, Wolverton. So when we get his will and track down, and then if we go and get wills of all of the neighbors of the people of his generation, we find the same thing. We find those names over and over and over, identifying all of these relationships. Next. And so these are, it was hard to read the will, but these are the children that are listed with names of spouses. Lydia Bell married Jacob Rush, Benjamin married Elizabeth Enoch, Jane Bell married Thomas Wolverton, Elizabeth married Joseph Fraser, and Mary married John Buckingham. And the way it's worded in the will is money was given to her son, Isaac, for her care. And so if the money is given to the son for her care, what assumption or hypothesis can we work on to prove or disprove Mary is probably a widow at that time? Not necessarily, but it might be a good working hypothesis for her if money is given to her son for her care. Next. And I don't know if you can see this, but those surnames are still in Morgan County. And you can kind of see a more, this isn't a current map, but you can see a more recent map where you see those land ownership map. You can see some of the same names. Next. So this is a different family. You want to look at the will of every family member and surrounding neighbors. And I know that gets a little tedious. But this is a will of Jacob Kofer. He's in Park County, Indiana. We're now in 1887. And he says, I, Jacob Kofer, being of weak body but sound mind and spirit, leave to my now wife. And he goes through and leaves whatever he's going to leave. And then in addition, I leave to my sister Elizabeth Hastings the rents of the crops of the back 40 acres of corn, and to her son Jesse the roan mare and 20 acres upon his majority. And so here again, a will is giving us, we now know that Elizabeth, we assume was Elizabeth Kofer. She's his sister. So if she is his full sister, her maiden name, we're going to assume is Kofer. She married Hastings and had a son named Jesse. Jesse, this tells us now, is not of legal age because he inherits this upon his majority. And again, it's not necessarily that he would mention his brother-in-law by name, but he probably would. And so again, it leads us to think maybe she is a widow at this time. And so if we're researching either Elizabeth Hastings, we've now found a brother, or if we're searching Jacob, it helps us tie in more family. Next. So this is that tax record, and we've got a Jesse Kofer again. And I know we lost some time trying to work out our technical difficulties, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. But we're in Park County still. We're starting in 1821, and we've gone through and we've picked out the surnames that we're looking for. And we're plotting out the acres. And I always put things, when I transcribe, I always transcribe with their misspellings, however they spell the name, however they spell the jurisdiction, however they spell raccoon, I follow it through as I find it. And so we have Jesse with 100 acres, Jacob with 120. And then we go down to the next year, and we have Jesse, Jacob with the same amount of land. And then we add George. George pops up. George has 50 acres. 1823, it's the same. 1824, found no records. 1825 is the same. And in the interest of saving time, we go on down, and there's a couple of years where we don't find any records, but we follow this, and this is, you know, this is going in and finding the records year after year after year. You want to start about 5 or 10 years before you think the family was in the area, and continue 5 or 10 years after you think they left. And so that's time consuming, and it's easy to hit a point where you think, oh gosh, you know, I'm not finding anything new. I mean, when you look at all the years that it's the same thing year after year, it's easy to give up. But if we follow down to 1835, now that follows several years of the same information, and then 2 years of not finding anything. And then we hit 1835, and now Elizabeth Kofer has 100 acres, Jacob has 120, and George has 50. So what has happened? We've lost Jesse. And by the way, this is a different Elizabeth. This is not his sister. The great thing about coming from the Midwest is that there was no originality, they had no creativity, and everybody had the same name. And the townships had the same names, and the counties had the same names. So you have to figure out who's who, and then you track them down. So we now have Elizabeth with 100 acres. So it looks like she has taken over Jesse's 100 acres. Jacob still has his 120, and George has 50. Next. So now we start with Elizabeth. We're at 1835, where her name first appears. And then we have a couple of names of no records, or a couple of years rather, of no records. And then it follows along with the same number of acres for everybody. And we go through the years. And then when we get down to, we've got 1842, where they're the same, 1843, they're the same. 1844, all of a sudden, Elizabeth is gone. Jacob now has 170 acres, and George has 100. So now what might our research hypothesis be? It might be that Elizabeth and Jesse were the parents of Jacob and George, and they both have now inherited some land. We'd have to track the land, obviously, and find more records. This is not enough to prove or disprove, but this is a pretty good clue that just off of tax records, we have a family unit in case we don't have them anyplace else. Now, obviously, they probably are going to be on the census and in some other records, but just an example that just from tax records, we've maybe put this family together. Next. And this is what I was talking about earlier about researching. Obviously, this is a census page, and you want to research 10 to 15 neighbors at least on each side, if not the page before. And you want to look for things like, is there a list of people who were born in the same place, maybe in a different state or at least a different county? You want to look at that, but just looking at the names and kind of any similarities, because again, the earlier the time, how far did they go to find a spouse? How, you know, and if they moved with their family, they're all going to be right there. Next. And then we've got our Kofers in there. Again, this is a little fuzzy. I don't know how well it shows, but everybody on this particular census page is related in one way or another. They're either cousins, siblings, or they've married into, one family is married into another family. And we have the Ames family, the Kofers, it just goes on and on. They are all related. Next. So this is a disability claim from the Civil War. And Frederick Carl is trying to get an increase on a new disability claim. And this was written by William Jenner in 1889. And I don't need to read it to you, but I will. It's in Crawford County, Indiana. And William says, I knew the claimant from boyhood and immediately on his return from service made his home with his brother Benjamin. So we now have a brother for Frederick. who lived immediately adjoining my father's farm and worked for my father, building a mill and running same after its completion. I know that claimant often complained of pains in hips and shoulders and was attended with a heart trouble, which some doctors called rheumatic affection of the heart. I know that claimant was often disabled and would not work for father in the water on account of the rheumatic affection. When he was laid up, his brother Thomas, so now we've got another brother, would sometimes help out at the mill. Father was glad of the help. When Thomas moved back to Evans Landing, and Evans Landing is probably the size of the room you're in. I don't know what size room you're in at the library, but Evans Landing is a teeny tiny little place in southern Indiana. Uncle John helped father with the mill when claimant was laid up. And then on my screen, I knew claimant as a hardy boy. I don't know if you see anything below that, but William Jenner is Frederick's brother-in-law, and my ancestor is Thomas. And so I now have more information on my Thomas because I branched out and started searching for his brothers. And as I was searching his brother, Frederick, I found this letter from Frederick's brother-in-law, William Jenner, who is now giving me more information on my Thomas, when his goal was to write a letter for his brother-in-law, Frederick. Hopefully that wasn't too disjointed. So just another example that if you just keep plugging along and researching the collateral people, you get these little puzzle pieces that eventually you can put together. So I can now tie Thomas to Evans Landing. I have a date to work from the date that the letter was written. And that's another couple of pieces for my puzzle on Thomas. Next. This is a land ownership map for Park County. And this part shows cemeteries, rivers, and roads. And what I did when I got my land ownership maps is I photocopied them on transparency paper that you use for an overhead projector, and then I overlaid them. So this started in the area where they lived. Next. And then I overlaid it with the land ownership part that shows the ownership, the names of the people who own the land. And you can see the highlighted areas. That's part of my Bell family. And down below, you can see the families that are related to them. And then I can see where it says 21, there's Clear Run Cemetery. There's another cemetery, Hartman Cemetery, that's next. It would be on 19. That didn't, the transparencies didn't line up together, but you can kind of look, they're not necessarily buried in the closest cemetery, but if you're having trouble finding the cemeteries, if you figure out, where all the family is and you can look at the closest cemetery, a lot of my family is at Clear Run Cemetery. Some of them are further out. There's actually one down on 31 Webster Cemetery where some of them are buried. But this is another way to kind of track families and see who purchased the family, who purchased it around the same time. Next. This is just how I wish cemeteries were laid out. We hear about when you do your cemetery research, you want to look at who's buried next to them. You want to copy down all the surnames. If the surname isn't important to you on that day, they may be, 6 months from now as you do more research. It would just be so much easier if this was the rule. Next. So Frederick Carl is my ancestor. I use the spelling C-A-R-L, but obviously in genealogy, spelling never counts. And so we use any spelling that we can tie to that person. So this is 1840. This is the 1840 census, and my Frederick Carl is listed next door to John Hart's, and this is in Ohio Township, Crawford County, Indiana. Next. And by the way, my Frederick Carl is my immigrant ancestor, is my alien ancestor rather, and not because he's my immigrant ancestor, but he's my alien ancestor because the spaceship dropped him off and picked him up a short time later, and I had nothing before or after, and I had only 4 or 5 documents during the time that he was here. And those documents were not giving me very much. And I looked and looked and looked for Frederick Carl. I looked for patients. I found her, but not too much farther. And then one day I realized, oh my goodness, all the records I have for Frederick Carl show John Hart's. So there they were in 1840 on the census together. Here, Frederick and patients are selling land to John Hart's, and this is 1857. And we're in Indiana, Crawford County. Next. Here's the 1850 or 1860 census, and look how close Patience Carl with a couple of her kids, there's one missing, but some of the children, and John Hart's are. And after I realized that every time I found Frederick or Patience, there was John, I abandoned Frederick because I now didn't like him any longer. He wasn't giving me any information. He ceased to be fun to research. And I started researching John Hart's, and it turns out that John Hart's was related to Patience. And when Frederick died, Frederick was a cabinet maker and woodworker. And when he died, John Hart's then went after people to get them to pay. There were a number of people who owed Frederick Carl money. And in one of them, Patience isn't even mentioned, but there's paperwork where John is saying, I am endeavoring to collect debts on behalf of my half-sister, and he's collecting money that is owed to a Frederick Carl. And so the more I researched John, the more information I found on Frederick. So it really, really, when you see names that are tied together, start researching the other name. If you're having difficulty finding information on your person, go after the other person. Next. So I'm going to jump over to law libraries, and I don't want to turn this into, especially since we're getting short on time, I don't want to turn it into a presentation on law libraries, but if you're not researching in the law library, please do. They are wonderful. And there are a lot of times where there's a disagreement within families. Obviously, anytime land or money or possessions is involved, everybody wants to be the one to inherit. Sometimes people go to court because that's how that jurisdiction divvies up land. You can't just say, oh yeah, they left me this amount, my sibling got that. That jurisdiction requires that you go to court to figure it out. In this case, it was contentious. This is 1926. And this is, even though they call it the Southwestern Reporter, their geography is a little strange. When you get into the law libraries, if you haven't already, you will discover that their geography is not maybe what we think of. This is Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, and Texas. I don't really consider Kentucky Southwest, but Kentucky is the state that I was interested in. Next. And this is the family. This is going to be too blurry to read, but all of the highlighted areas focus on a family where 2 brothers disputed who was going to receive a particular plot of land. And what you find in reporters is if a case is used as case law, like you watch the shows with like Perry Mason and others where they cite a certain case, this is where they cite it from. And if the case is cited, or if somebody says, oh, I don't like the way this turned out, I'm going to go back to court, then it might be in one of these reporters. Next. And so this kind of blows it up. During this case, one of the brothers died and his widow continued the case. And in this is a couple of pages long, but you can see here that it gives the legal description of the land, and it's the old meets and bounds, which is, I start at the big oak tree and I grow, and here it's going down the little crooked branch that empties into Wolf Creek, and on and on and on. So I now have the legal description of this land. I also have family relationships, because the widow, when she went back to court on her husband's behalf, she had to show how she was related, listed all the kids. And then you can see on the left-hand side here, this tract of land in the petition was conveyed originally in February of 1899. So from my 1926 reporter, I've gone back. I know when the first person in the family acquired this land. And then as I've got the legal description, and as I go through, I get all these family relationships. Next. So on the law library, it can be things other than land disputes. It's, anybody that is suing anybody else for any reason. If you find your family, it's a gold mine. This one is somebody contacted me and they were trying to find information on Edward Lewis. And they just they couldn't find anything on Edward's father. So Annie Carey married John Lewis, and Annie and John had a son, Edward. Edward is the focus of our research. John Lewis, Edward's father, died. Annie she remarried then, and she married a John Hamilton. John Hamilton and James Butler were business partners. And then John Hamilton died. And then James Butler, the business partner, died. So there was a newspaper obituary for James Butler. That's the business partner. And it mentions that he left his business to the wife and stepson of his late partner. So now we're researching. So we started out looking for Edward, but now we're researching the stepfather, John Hamilton, and John Hamilton's business partner, James Butler. Next. And when we continue looking in the newspapers, we see an article that says on the death of James Butler that he mentions that Edward Lewis, stepson of James Butler's late partner, rushed back from Horseheads, New York, when this James Butler died, where he was visiting relatives. Now, all of these people lived in Southern California. So we didn't have any idea yet that there was any connection to New York. But from spreading our scope out and researching the stepfather, and then the stepfather, and Edward's mother didn't have any more children, so we didn't have any siblings to research. So we went to the next person, the stepfather. We ran out of ideas there. So then we started to research the business partner, and by researching the business partner who had no family, we found this. So the bullseye of just spreading out layer after layer after layer, and the collateral research really does work. Next. So this one, I'm going to go through this quickly. I see that it's a little after 7, and I don't want to hold you up and have you not have enough time to socialize and eat those great lemon bars. Those sounded wonderful, and get out of there on time. But this is an interesting case. So there's the estate sale in Washington County, Pennsylvania in 1836, and Elijah Blue has passed away. So probate opened in March, and there was an estate sale in April. There was no land, no surviving documents that listed, there's no list for next of kin, nothing listed a widow, no relatives. So we're looking at this estate sale to try to figure out who is who. 19 people purchased items. Sarah Blue purchased a bed, a bedstead, furnishings, and crockery. Nancy Blue purchased 2 beds with the bedstead, furnishings, chest, cupboard, spinning wheel, clock, desk, table, pots, crockery, knives and forks, sheep, cows, calves, horses, corn, fodder, table linen, and a brush and comb. So we've got 2 women. Well, first of all, in 1836, how likely is it that a woman would even be in it at an estate sale? Highly unlikely. I mean, women just typically did not go. So that's something to keep in mind. And then we want to look at the amount of items purchased and the type of items purchased. So next, Daniel Blue bought a bed, bedstead, watch, farm implements. And then an Elizabeth Olinger bought linens, books, miscellaneous items. Abel Knight, farm implements. Sarah, Nancy, and Elizabeth were the only females listed that purchased anything. Sarah, Nancy, Daniel, and Elizabeth purchased 60% of household goods, and 15 people purchased the remainder. And then go back a slide 1, if you would. And then look at what Nancy purchased. So lots of people might buy the spinning wheel and the cupboard and a clock and a desk, but a brush and comb, that looks a bit interesting that she bought a brush and comb. So go next slide. And then the next slide. So in August of 1836, Sarah Blue married Benjamin Olinger. Remember, we had Elizabeth Olinger that purchased some items, and Abel Knight was a witness. Abel Knight is listed on the 1830 census, living in proximity and in some other records to Elijah Blue. And the last record in the county for Elijah, who's the person who passed away, was 1833. Next. There were other Knight families in the area, and one is James. James Knight's 1840 will left 2 horses to grandson Daniel Blue. Daniel Blue was on that estate sale buying items from that, or was on that estate sale list buying items from that estate sale. With no other females in the area with the surname of Blue that are the right age to be Elijah's wife, can we again have a hypothesis that Nancy is his widow and she bought back, she owed money, was forced to have an estate sale, and purchased her own items so that she could keep them, a couple of things being her brush and comb. And if she is the relationship to Daniel that we think she is, if she's Daniel's mother, is she James's daughter? So just from this estate sale, by figuring out who lived in the area, who purchased what, and just keeping an open eye for possible family connections, we now have a hypothesis that we can tie the Knight family and the Blue family together by who purchased items, and then moving on and finding who married somebody living close by. Next. So well, before we go, did that make sense? Did you follow along? I tried not to go too fast, but I want to be aware of time.
Yes. Everyone's saying yes.
Okay. So success in genealogy is not so much a matter of making the big discoveries, but the ability to connect the small ones. And hopefully in some of our examples here, we've seen that connecting those small finds and looking at the big picture and then focusing in on the smaller details, our genealogy jigsaw puzzles are going to come together faster when we do our collateral research than when we just focus on, no, I don't want to branch out that far. I just want these people in my focus group or in this particular family. when the farther we branch out, the more information we find. Next. So just a little recap and some interesting information. Sociologists have found that the strongest family ties are between women, and the strongest of those are between mothers and their grown daughters. And what usually is the case there, we're searching for people with two different surnames. And so, you know, we have to follow along. But if we're lucky enough to find old letters, diaries, you know, information like that, that can just be a gold mine. And that social relationships among families obviously are not broken by geographic distance. And so that's really important to remember in times of record loss, that, you know, we may need to dig a little bit deeper. But if we can find some of those records that that are used by both, that's going to take our research even farther. And legal records of persons leaving no direct descendants often contain more family information than those with direct descendants. And that is very true in court cases and newspaper research. And then what we just saw with the with Edward and Annie and John, her two husbands, John, the ones that had no direct descendants, they spent a little more time on, not more time, but who they left their legacy and leading the business and so forth gave us more information. So we need to thoroughly research everybody. Next. The other thing to always remember, and I bring this up no matter what I'm talking about, if you don't cite your sources now, please do. Please start tonight. Cite your sources, cite your sources. Doesn't matter if you had a dream, if your neighbor told you, if it's from Great Aunt Sophie, cite your sources, because the more complicated your research, the more important it is to know where that information came from. Next. And then just again, to recap, evaluate the information in the source, create a full source citation, record your findings, citation, and evaluation in a research report. At least I like to do that. I can't keep it all in my head, so I like to write it out. Every record you find should have information that leads you to additional research. And then make a note if a discovery identifies a new individual, locale, or circumstance. Obviously, we already do that. And then add any new repository, record, source, or strategy to your research plan. And I think this is, all of this is we already know this, but it's easy sometimes, I think, as we get farther into our research, that sometimes we let one of these go, even though we know that this is good research strategy. We tend to get away from it. Next. And hopefully the siblings will tell you so much more than your direct ancestor. And I thank you for inviting me, and I am so sorry for the technical difficulty. And thank you for advancing slides for me. Are there any questions, comments?
Well, I'd like to know how you get the court records, the legal lawsuit things. How did you find those?
So there are a lot of ways to find legal records, and a lot of those are at the courthouse for a sorry, I'm trying to get my screen just went blank. It kind of threw me there for a moment. That was from a reporter from a law library. And if you go to the law library, they have reporters and different publications that have published these old court cases. And again, it's a case that makes case law. So not every court case is in there, but I have yet to talk to somebody that went to a law library and didn't find something on their family. And the nice thing about these reporters is that law libraries have them for the entire country, and every county in California is required to have a law library that is open to the general public. So typically it's in the county seat. It could be, you know, it could be a law school. It could be that county's law library. Sometimes they're in the courthouse. I don't know for your county where the law library is, but it would be easy just to Google law library, you know, and see where it is. But there is one. It's required by law in the state of California, and it's just a fun day to go and search in the law library. And the law libraries I've been to, the librarians are very, very helpful and friendly. They don't say, oh, well, if you're not an attorney and you're not here working, you know, for something important, you can't use the library. They're very, very helpful. Did that answer your question? Did that?
Yes, that does. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Are there indexes to these law libraries, or when you get there, are you hunting and pecking through every book?
There are sort of indexes. And so what they have is, they have case reporters, they have regional reporters, and these will be, and then they have the decennial series, they have the digest. So you have to look, each one is set up in a different way. And some are alphabetical by who brought the suit. And so you can look it up that way. And they're all a little bit different. Like the federal digest will be, that's more by the case, and the reporters you can look up by, you know, who brought the suit. And then sometimes you can also find by who was sued. But the law librarians can help you find that.
Any other questions?
No.
I thank you very much, Pamela.
Well, thank you. Again, I apologize for going over time and all the technical difficulties, but thank you for being so technical on your side and figuring everything out.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good evening.